If you grab your Bible, go over to Ezra 4 with me this morning. It's got to be right at the end there. In December of 1914, there was a man named Ernest Shackleton who was an experienced merchant and naval officer who decided to set off on an expedition known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. His ship was the Endurance. It was crewed by a group that he hand-selected to take on this very perilous, very dangerous journey. And after about a month, they wound up treading ice, which they carefully broke through, moving through the Weddell Sea. And on January 19th, they came to a very thick portion of ice in worsening conditions when it became so thick that it was bound to the hull and the boat stopped dead in the water. Now, after about another month trapped there, unable to move, the crew realized they'd be stuck there until the coming spring. And so they set to work converting the ship into a winter station to survive the terrible cold that was definitely going to get worse before it got better. And so they stayed there in the Antarctic, trapped there until about September, when the ice finally began to melt. But that freedom that comes with the melting came with a cost. The pressure it put on the ship destroyed the hull, and the water began to pour in. So the crew abandoned onto the ice floes that were there, and they set up camp, and they sat there and watched their ship sink slowly over time until by November it was no longer visible. And so then, after another harrowing series of events, one ice floe to another ice floe, drifting at sea, it was the following April when they finally got to the safety of solid ground after 497 days from setting off on their original journey. And they didn't set off on this journey to be that crew who spent 497 days on icy waters. They did not sign up to be the people to go through those hardships, but circumstances forced them to be a people of patient endurance, who eventually found their way back where they started. And what's interesting about that story of being stuck, paused, trapped, and watching like everything that you were hoping for is sinking down is basically what's happening here in Ezra 4. Ezra 4, as we saw last week, these were a people who were confronted with challenges set forth by their enemies, challenges that came from the outside, forcing them to patiently endure while the work they had set onto was stuck unmoving. Last week we saw the weapons that the enemies were using. This week I want us to look at something a little different in that same vein of thought, though, and that's to answer the question, what do we do when the enemy's plans work? What do we do when their weapons are effective? When everything's stacked against you? How do you find a way out? How do you get unstuck from the ice in the midst of all this? Well, this morning we're going to see how that happened here in this transition between Ezra 4 and Ezra 5. And so we start at verse 24 of chapter 4. We see first the frustrations of the enemy. It says, "Now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained at a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia." Backing up, at the beginning of chapter 4, the enemies of the exiles, described by the writer, sought to introduce a compromise by allowing them to build the temple alongside them. These were the people who had been transplanted over there by the king of Assyria. And though they acknowledged the God of Israel, it says that they feared the Lord, but also worshipped idols. And so when the exiles of Judah returned from Babylon, they represented a threat to these people's way of life. And so they sought to exert control and influence over them. And Zerubbabel and Joshua refused. And so the enemies then switched tactics and they began to antagonize them. And you recall last week, when it says that they did these things, they discouraged them, they made them afraid, and they bribed the officials against them. Derek Kidner, Old Testament scholar, notes that the structure of that sentence is the sense that they kept on doing these things. So they constantly discouraged them, constantly made them afraid, constantly used external forces against them. And then here's the thing. We're used to these victory stories, especially in Ezra. The first 3 chapters are a story of victory after victory. And here, when we get to chapter 4, we find that they succeeded. No longer was this a victory story. Now it's a story of a type of defeat. And as we find, there's the intervening passage that we didn't really cover, but verse 6 through 23, and we see the movement of their work as they worked against them over a long period of time. And so like the crew of the Endurance that began with such hope, their efforts had led to this moment of rededication. Those long years of holding on to the promises of God. And now, once they finally reached them, they were dead in the water. Because 6 through 23, that intervening section that leads here to this verse 24, that's 18 years. 18 years since they started to there. It was stopped at a total standstill. Now, those of you who've worked in construction and contracting, standstill is a word you're familiar with. Delay is a word you're familiar with, but I doubt any of you have dealt with 18 years of it. This timeline over this period, it overlaps with the book of Esther. It goes into the book of Nehemiah. It's almost 2 decades of waiting stuck here, remained at this standstill. And so when we think of this, just put yourself in their shoes for a moment. 18 years, and they didn't stop living their lives. They didn't stop worshiping. They didn't stop working. And they didn't stop moving. But each day of those 18 years, living their lives, they'd look and see the place that had once been such a symbol of hope to them, the place that had once been such a victory to them, where they'd stood not so long ago to rejoice. They'd remember the day when those shouts of joy were mixed with tears of regret, the place where sorrow for the failures of the past had been eclipsed with hope for the future, but now it's standing there, not moving, nothing happening, frozen in time. Can you imagine how incredibly frustrating that would have been? How heartbreaking. How discouraging. Now, maybe you can't imagine that easily. Maybe because you've been in a place personally where you felt like that's how it is. You come to a place where you feel things are finally going to work out, then you hit a standstill. Then you hit a pause. You run into a roadblock. You get stuck in the ice. Now, that could be personal life, financial life, your spiritual life. Trying to move on in your career, but you keep winding back up at square one. You're trying to get more stable financially, but run into one thing after another. You're trying to grow in your relationship with the Lord, but that one besetting sin or that one thing that happened just keeps eating away at your progress, and you struggle to just shake it off. Ezra 4 provides us with a picture of how opposition always arises against what God is doing. And it's something of ongoing significance throughout all of the Bible and throughout all of history, because God's work, if it's with His people corporately or if it's with you individually, will always be met with opposition. Jesus warned us it would be like this. The apostles saw it firsthand. Every time the church would grow, right alongside of it would come resistance. And every time the apostles would accomplish great things, there was infighting, disagreement, prejudice, and some other form of trouble that would rise up in the middle of them. And Paul, he even had a personal tormentor assigned to him. It may take different forms. It may come in different ways. It may even come from multiple directions at once. But one thing we can be sure of is that when God is trying to do something, the enemy is always working against it. And the part that we have to wrestle with in our talk of spiritual warfare, in our talk of enduring, in our talk of how to deal with the Christian life, the life of faith in this world, is that sometimes it looks like it works. Sometimes you hit a standstill. Here, the enemies halted the progress of the temple. They brought accusations against the exiles, and it worked. In the same period of time, Haman brought accusation against the Jews in the story of Esther, and it worked. Previously, the enemies of Daniel brought accusations against him, and it worked. Our enemy, the accuser of the brethren, the adversary, uses those same old tricks, and the thing is, sometimes they work. So what do we do? But I want you to note something on that, actually, first. In all of those examples, was it the fault of the people that the scheme succeeded? It was not the fault of Daniel. It wasn't his lack of faith. It wasn't Esther's sin. It wasn't the exile's weakness that led to these things actually working against them. Do not assume the reason you've hit a roadblock is your fault. Sometimes, yes. Sometimes it is our sin, our faithlessness, our negligence that brings us problems. It opens a door, the enemy walks through. But not always. Sometimes these things happen because that's just what it is, living in a fallen world. God is not punishing you when bad things happen. Just because it looks like He's winning doesn't mean God gave up. That may be what we think, that may be how we feel, but that is a result of our own brokenness and not a result of what you find in this book. God has reconciled Himself through Jesus. When He looks at us, He sees the benefit of Christ that He's brought upon us. If you are in Christ, you are united with Him. Who He is who you are. What He has is yours. It may feel like that enemy is winning now because you're outside of that, but that is not the case. But you know what? Even with Jesus, there was about 3 days where it looked like the enemy won. It may feel like you've lost. I imagine that's probably what it felt like to those disciples on that Friday. Until, that is, Sunday came. The frustration of the enemy in this story and yours is not the final word of the story. And there's only one place we can turn to when it seems like we've lost. When the enemy has triumphed. And that's what we find here in chapter 5 as we move forward. We see that the only way to answer the frustrations of the enemy is to find a foundation in God's promise. It says in verse 1, "But when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, began to rebuild God's house in Jerusalem. The prophets of God were with them, helping them." So, this is kind of that old proverb about getting back on the horse, which is true. When we fall, when the enemy gets the upper hand, or so it appears, there is only one real choice for us to make. When are you going to climb back on that saddle? Unlike what you'll find in influencer culture and clever talks from people who do little national tours and books as people who usually are not Christian, this is not the kind of thing you can accomplish through self-actualization and effort. You do not overcome the enemy with personal discipline, but you do it by remembering who it is you belong to. These exiles were down for a long time, 18 to 20 years, since they'd returned and began to rebuild this temple. It took that long for them to get back on the horse. And this isn't in my notes, but let me say this. It doesn't matter how long it's been, there's always still a time to get back on. You may feel like you've lost all this time, the enemy's stolen all this time from you. There's still time to get back on. 18 to 20 years, how long has it been for you? There is still time to find a way back. And they didn't do this because they got tired of looking at the ruins. They didn't do it because they decided to raise a defiant fist to the king. It wasn't even because they had some amazing inner drive. Here's what it is. It says, when the prophets prophesied to them, in the name of the God of Israel who was over them, they began to rebuild. In that 18 to 20 year trial that they faced, frozen, stuck in the ice, God answered by sending them exactly what they needed. He provided for them and He spoke to them. He assured them. He gave them all that they needed to continue the work. And you'll notice He didn't do it immediately. When you get stuck in the middle of one of these things, one of these seasons where it looks like the enemy's winning, you're like, God help. Sooner would be better. You know, one thing I found out, and you know, everybody says it, but then you find it out personally and you're like, oh, that's what they meant. God really doesn't work on our timetable. You know, who has a day planner? Are you one of those nerds? Apple Calendar, one of those guys? God really doesn't care what your calendar says. You can't pencil him in. He only does it when it's time. He only answers when he chooses to. And typically, no matter how long it's been, that's the right time. And you'll notice, here they are back at it again. They didn't stop and complain that God hadn't done it sooner. They didn't do anything. They didn't really grumble. They didn't really move against, and they didn't not build because they were mad at them. What they did is when they received the word, when they received the provision, they answered through action. Probably the hardest part of dealing with those seasons is that waiting. It's the losing battle, staying in the middle of it. But God's plan will always go forward. God's will always be accomplished. Sometimes, though, we have to sweat it out for a little while. Sometimes we got to sit in the ruins. You know, there have been times in working with the church, you know, coming out of a finance meeting, for instance, and you got to go sit for a while and you got to pray. Maybe you've had the same experience. There's times when you're waiting on an answer for something, a resolution, and you're sitting there in the middle of the night thinking about it. And as you've waited on the Lord so long, you kind of wonder, Lord, is heaven operating like the DMV right now? I don't really know what you're doing. It's like that. Sometimes we have to wait before the answer comes because sometimes we cannot appreciate the provision until we've waited for it. Because we need to realize how desperately we need him. God's faithfulness is a lot like Gandalf. It's never late, shows up precisely when it intends to. Some of you got that. Well, that's why we don't have to worry. That's why we don't have to despair when it looks like the enemy is won, when those tools of discouragement, fear, and pressure are effective, because we have an unshakable confidence that God will provide, and he will show up, and he will have the last word, and he will do it in his time. Why? Because he told us. In their case, he sent them prophets to those exiles. And so also, you know what he's done here? He sent a word to you. Hebrews 1 tells us, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times in different ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. God has appointed him the heir of all things and made the universe through him. So our hope of this ultimate victory, it's not found in ourselves, it's found in the foundation of God's promise and who he is. Our hope is settled there. Our strength is found there. Our patience is found there. We don't need to listen to the taunts of the enemy. We don't have to despair at the fact it looks like they're winning. We don't need to give up when we are discouraged, afraid, or pressured, because we have a hope with a foundation. The promises that God has clearly given us. Here's a couple of them. Weeping may stay overnight, but there is joy in the morning. Psalm 30, verse 5. Psalm 37 says, a person's steps are established by the Lord, and he takes pleasure in his way. Though he falls, he will not be overwhelmed, because the Lord supports him with his hand. I want to stop on that. That's a pet verse of mine. It's when you have a child you're teaching to walk, and you hold their hands while they're wobbling. When it says that the Lord supports him with his hand, that's the picture that's being given there. He's there with the steps of a person, a grown person, but it's as if he is guiding us step by step through that long path. The psalmist continues, I've been young and now I am old. Now I am old. And he still has that picture of God supporting him like a toddler. Yet I have not seen the righteous abandoned or his children begging for bread. It doesn't matter how stuck, harassed, paused, or defeated you are. You might feel like God's purpose in your life has just moved on. God's purpose for a church is delayed, or the life of your business or the life of your kids, the trajectory they're on, whatever it is. It might feel like all that's been hit by a roadblock at a standstill. It may look like the enemy won. He took everything away, but there's more to the story. The ending hasn't been written yet. There's more to say. Have you seen this thing? I saw one this week. It's the semicolon. People have it tattooed either on their wrist, their arm. Some do it in other places. Or they'll have it, I saw one on a bumper sticker in somebody's car. Remembering your middle school grammar, a semicolon is used when you could end a sentence but with a period, but you choose to keep going instead. The purpose people have behind the semicolon is they reach a point in their life where it feels like everything was over, or where they feel like they were about to write the end of their own story, but they kept going instead. And so the semicolon becomes this picture for them of that moment. When the enemy is winning against you, when the enemy is winning against your family, your kids, your career, your grandkids, whatever it be, that's a semicolon moment. Story's not over yet. There's no period there. It's not over till it's over. Because the enemy doesn't get to write the end of the story. God has. And his ending is a lot better than the one you think is coming. The only catch is you can't just, and I know some of you do this, and as a reader, don't do this. You can't just flip to the end and see what it is. Because it hasn't been written yet. Well, it has been written, but not in ways you can see. You can't cheat. You can only take it one page at a time. Sometimes one sentence at a time. So no matter where you are, if you're stuck in a place like this, in waiting, in standstill, stuck in the ice, you feel like it's a time to start moving again, but you just don't know how, be encouraged to this. God will move with you in his time. He will give you everything you need, every promise to do it with. All you need to do is wait for his signal to get back on the horse. Amen. Please.